June 23, 1981. The Tunisian desert was 127 degrees. Young actor Harrison Ford was dying in a medic tent, burning with fever, while studio executives stood outside debating whether to shut down production. Mac Brennan had been coordinating stunts for 15 years. He'd seen actors get hurt before, but he'd never seen someone poisoned. The water bottle Ford drank from that morning? Mac watched Jimmy Chen, the rival actor's handler, spike it with contaminated liquid from the craft services cooler. Chen thought he was just making Ford sick enough to miss a few days of shooting. Instead, Ford nearly died. What happened next changed everything. The studio boss declared Ford finished, career over. But Ford crawled out of that tent, walked onto set with dysentery ravaging his body, and delivered the most iconic improvised scene in film history. The scene that made Indiana Jones immortal. For 43 years, Mac kept the secret. Until yesterday, when his granddaughter called asking questions about a documentary she's directing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mac's weathered hands trembled as he set down the phone. Through the diner's grease-stained windows, the Mojave stretched endlessly toward the San Bernardino Mountains, the same unforgiving landscape that had nearly claimed Hollywood's future 30 years ago. But it wasn't the desert heat making him sweat now. "Grandpa Mac?" Sarah's voice had been different on the call. Professional, distant. "I'm working on something about the Raiders of the Lost Ark shoot. There are some inconsistencies in the production reports from Tunisia. People are saying you were there." He'd deflected, made excuses about his memory failing, promised to call her back. But Sarah Brennan didn't get to be one of Hollywood's most respected documentary filmmakers by accepting evasion. She had her grandmother's persistence and her grandfather's instinct for finding the truth hidden beneath Hollywood's glossy surface. The lunch rush was over, leaving Mac alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the ghost of decisions that had shaped 4 decades. He walked behind the counter, muscle memory guiding him through the motions of cleaning coffee pots and wiping down surfaces. Simple, honest work that had kept his hands busy and his conscience buried. But burial wasn't the same as death. Some secrets grew stronger in darkness. The bell above the door chimed, and Mac looked up to see a man in an expensive suit picking his way carefully across the cracked linoleum. Wrong shoes for the desert, wrong clothes for a truck stop diner. Everything about him screamed Hollywood, and Mac felt his chest tighten. "Marcus Brennan?" The man's smile was practiced, predatory. "I'm David Kellerman, executive producer at Meridian Pictures. I was hoping we could talk." Mac kept cleaning the coffee pot. "We're closed between lunch and dinner. This won't take long." Kellerman slid onto a stool at the counter, ignoring Mac's body language. "I understand your granddaughter is working on a project about classic film productions. Specifically, some behind-the-scenes stories from the early 80s. The coffee pot slipped in Mac's hands, clattering against the counter. He caught it before it fell, but not before Kellerman noticed the tremor. "Funny thing about documentary filmmakers," Kellerman continued, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "They think they're investigative journalists. Sometimes they dig into stories that are better left alone. Stories that could hurt people who've built remarkable careers." Mac finally looked up, meeting the producer's eyes. "What do you want?" "Your granddaughter has been asking questions about water quality on foreign shoots, about an incident involving food poisoning, about why certain production reports were sealed." Kellerman's smile never wavered. "We both know there was no story there, just unfortunate circumstances that nearly derailed one of cinema's greatest careers." The weight of the lie settled between them like dust. Mac had carried it so long he'd almost convinced himself it was true. Almost. "Harrison Ford got dysentery," Mac said carefully. "It happens on foreign shoots. Bad water, unfamiliar food." "Exactly." Kellerman leaned forward. "And when he recovered, he gave us one of the most brilliant improvised moments in film history. Everyone won. The studio, the actor, the fans. Why complicate that story with conspiracy theories?" Through the window, Mac watched an 18-wheeler pull into the parking lot, its chrome catching the afternoon sun. The driver would want coffee and pie. maybe directions to the interstate. Simple needs with simple solutions. Nothing like the maze of loyalties and lies that had brought Kellerman to his door. "Sarah's a smart girl," Max said. "If there was nothing to find, she wouldn't have called." "That's what worries us." Kellerman pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like financial documents. "She's built quite a career. Awards, acclaim, studio deals. It would be tragic if this project damaged her reputation. Documentary filmmakers who traffic in unfounded accusations tend to find funding difficult to secure." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mac had spent 30 years believing his silence protected people. Harrison Ford's career, his own family's future, the magic of cinema itself. But protection built on lies wasn't protection at all. It was a trap, and now Sarah was walking into it blindly. "I think you should leave," Mac said. Kellerman stood, straightening his jacket with theatrical precision. "Think about what I've said, Marcus. Some stories are worth more buried than told, for everyone's sake." After the producer left, Max stood alone in the empty diner, surrounded by the accumulated weight of years. Outside, the desert wind rattled the windows like ghosts demanding attention. He thought about a young Harrison Ford crawling out of a medic tent with death in his eyes and determination in his heart. He thought about Jimmy Chen, who'd disappeared from Hollywood 6 months after Tunisia and never worked again. He thought about studio executives who'd built empires on calculated silences. Most of all, he thought about his granddaughter, brilliant and fearless, and walking toward a truth that could destroy everything she'd worked for. Mac reached for his phone, Sarah's number still on the screen from her earlier call. 43 years of silence was a long time, but perhaps it was long enough. Mac's finger hovered over the call button, Sarah's name glowing on the cracked screen of his ancient flip phone. The afternoon light slanting through the diner's windows had shifted, casting longer shadows across the checkerboard floor where his late wife Ellen had once danced to the jukebox after closing time. She'd been gone 8 years now, taking with her the only person who'd known the full weight of what he carried. The phone felt heavier than it should. One call could unravel everything, or save it. He wasn't sure which scared him more. The bell chimed again as the trucker pushed through the door, bringing the smell of diesel and road dust. Mac pocketed the phone and fell back into the rhythm that had sustained him for 3 decades. Coffee black, slice of apple pie, directions to the 15 North. Simple exchanges that required nothing more than muscle memory and surface pleasantries. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mac," the trucker said, settling his considerable bulk onto the reinforced stool at the far end of the counter. Mac managed a smile that felt like cracked leather. "Just thinking about old times, Pete." The dangerous kind of thinking. Pete had been stopping here twice a month for 15 years, hauling freight between Los Angeles and Phoenix. He'd watched Mac's hair go from salt and pepper to winter white, had seen the photographs on the wall multiply as Sarah's career flourished. "Everything all right?" The question hung between them, and Mac realized how transparent his distress must be. Pete wasn't the type to probe, which made his concern more pointed. Mac slid the pie across the counter, noticing how his own reflection wavered in the stainless steel surface. An old man who'd built a life on being invisible, suddenly feeling exposed. "Family stuff," Mac said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Through the window, he could see heat shimmers rising from the asphalt like spirits. This place had been his sanctuary, the antithesis of Hollywood's manufactured glamour. Real food for real people, honest work with honest pay. No scripts, no takes, no studio executives measuring every word for its potential to create or destroy careers. But sanctuaries, Mac had learned, were only as strong as the walls built around them, and Kellerman's visit had revealed cracks Mac hadn't realized were there. He thought about Sarah at 8 years old, sitting in this same spot where Pete now enjoyed his pie, her small hands sticky with syrup as she peppered him with questions about his days on movie sets. She'd been fascinated by the magic of filmmaking, the way stories came alive through collaboration and technical wizardry. He'd fed her sanitized tales of adventure and camaraderie, painting Hollywood as a place where dreams came true through hard work and talent. He'd never told her about the other side, the calculations, the compromises, the way truth could be molded like clay in the hands of people with enough power and motivation. He'd wanted to preserve her wonder, to let her believe in the nobility of storytelling. Now that protection felt like a disservice. Sarah had built her career on seeking truth, on pulling back curtains others preferred to keep closed. How could he have expected her to avoid this particular story forever? The coffee maker gurgled, marking time like a mechanical heartbeat. Mac refilled Pete's cup automatically, his mind drifting to that sweltering morning in Tunisia when everything had changed. Harrison Ford emerging from the medical tent, pale but determined, ready to shoot the most improvised scene of his career. The crew's nervous laughter when Ford drew his gun instead of engaging the sword-wielding extra. The collective exhale when Steven Spielberg called cut with delight instead of frustration. Everyone had celebrated the moment's spontaneous genius. Only Mac and a handful of others knew it had been born from desperation and cover-up, not inspiration. "Pie's good today," Pete said, breaking Mac's reverie. "Ellen's recipe?" Mac nodded, though his throat felt too tight for words. Ellen had known everything, had been there in the early days when the weight of silence was crushing him, when nightmares about Jimmy Chen's terrified face kept him awake. She'd helped him understand that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone, but she'd also understood why he couldn't set them down. She always said the secret was the cinnamon. Mac managed. "Smart woman. You were lucky to have her." Lucky. Mac rolled the word around in his mind like a bitter pill. Was it luck that had brought Ellen into his life, or just the universe's way of giving him the strength to carry his secrets? Was it luck that Sarah had inherited both her grandmother's compassion and her grandfather's stubborn pursuit of truth? Pete finished his pie and left exact change, plus his usual generous tip. The diner fell quiet again, leaving Mac alone with the accumulated weight of 43 years' worth of unanswered questions. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Grandpa, I found something in the production notes. We need to talk." Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows like whispers from the past demanding to be heard. Mac's hands shook as he read Sarah's text again, the words blurring on the small screen. Found something in the production notes. The careful distance in her earlier phone call suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't his granddaughter seeking family stories anymore. This was an investigative filmmaker following a trail. Before he could respond, his phone rang. Not Sarah's number. Unknown caller, but the area code made his blood freeze. 323. Los Angeles. Marcus Brennan? The voice was older, rougher than Kellerman's corporate smoothness. Mac recognized it immediately, though he hadn't heard it in over 4 decades. Jimmy Chen. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Mac gripped the counter's edge, his knuckles white against the worn formica. Jimmy Chen, the young props assistant who'd been there that morning in Tunisia, who'd seen everything, who'd vanished from Hollywood 6 months later like smoke. "You remember?" Jimmy's laugh held no humor. "I wasn't sure you would. 30 years running a diner. That's a long time to pretend the past doesn't exist." "Jimmy, how did you—" "Your granddaughter found me." The words hit Mac like a physical blow. Smart girl, persistent. She tracked down 3 crew members Meridian's lawyers couldn't silence. Turns out when you disappear from Hollywood, you don't disappear from the world. Mac's legs felt weak. He sank onto the stool Pete had vacated, the phone pressed against his ear like a lifeline to a drowning past. "She knows," Jimmy continued. "About the coffee, about Bradley Morrison's handler slipping something extra into Harrison's morning cup, about how I tried to warn someone, anyone, before Ford collapsed, about how you were the only one who believed me." The memories crashed back with nauseating clarity. Jimmy, barely 21, frantically approaching crew members with wild theories about sabotage. Mac, initially dismissive, until he'd seen the handler, Morrison's personal assistant, near the craft services table that fatal morning. The man's nervous glances, his quick departure when Ford's symptoms began. "I kept quiet," Mac whispered. "I kept the secret. Ford recovered, became a star. Ford nearly died." Jimmy's voice cracked with old anguish. "And Bradley Morrison got written out of the sequel before shooting even wrapped. Funny how that worked out. Almost like someone knew Ford would pull through and Morrison's career would crater anyway." Through the diner's windows, the desert heat created wavering mirages on the horizon. Mac had built his life here believing in the solidity of silence, the safety of distance. But mirages, he was learning, could be more real than the ground beneath your feet. Why now? Mac asked. Why talk to Sarah? You've been invisible for 30 years. Because I'm dying. The words fell like stones in still water. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And because your granddaughter isn't just making a documentary about raiders, she's investigating a pattern. Actors who got mysteriously sick on sets where they were being replaced, crew members who disappeared after asking questions, production reports that were sealed without explanation. Mac's chest tightened. A pattern? Hollywood's dirty little secret, Mac. How many accidents and illnesses were really sabotage? How many careers were made and broken by people willing to poison the competition? Sarah's connecting dots that go back decades. Meridian Pictures, Kellerman's mentor Roy Whitman, shell companies that employed handlers and fixers. She doesn't know what she's walking into, Mac breathed. No, Jimmy agreed. But she's walking anyway. Question is, are you going to let her walk alone? The line went quiet except for Jimmy's labored breathing. Mac could picture him, the earnest young man who'd tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his career, now an old man racing against time to balance the scales. They threatened her, Mac said. Kellerman came here today, said she could lose everything if she pursues this. She'll lose more if she doesn't. They're already moving to discredit her research. Kellerman's people are seeding stories about documentary filmmakers who fabricate conspiracies for publicity. By the time they're done, she'll look like a hack chasing fantasies. Mac closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's eager 8-year-old face asking about movie magic, then her determined adult expression in newspaper photos, accepting awards for exposing corporate corruption. His granddaughter, who'd inherited Ellen's moral compass and his own stubborn refusal to let lies stand unchallenged. I have copies, Jimmy continued. Original production notes, witness statements that were buried, financial records showing payments to Morrison's handler right after the Tunisia shoot. Everything Sarah needs to prove what really happened. But she needs someone on the inside to verify it. Someone who was there. The desert wind rattled the diner's windows again, and this time Mac heard it clearly, not whispers from the past, but a call to action. 43 years of silence hadn't protected anyone, it had only protected the lie. Where do you want to meet? Mac asked. The words hung in the desert air like a challenge Mac couldn't take back. He'd crossed a line that had defined his life for 4 decades, and already he could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. Not over the phone, Jimmy said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They monitor everything now. There's a coffee shop in Victorville, off the 15, the Sundown Cafe. Tomorrow, noon. Max started to respond, but the line went dead. He stared at the phone, its silence more deafening than any conversation. Through the window, he watched a dust devil spiral across the parking lot, picking up debris and casting it aside like discarded secrets. The dinner rush would start in 2 hours. Mac moved mechanically through his prep routine, slicing onions, checking the grill, restocking napkin dispensers. But his hands felt disconnected from his body, performing tasks while his mind reeled with implications. Meeting Jimmy meant stepping back into a world he'd fled, acknowledging truths he'd buried so deep they'd become part of his foundation. The bell chimed, and Mac looked up to see Rita Valdez pushing through the door. She owned the auto repair shop next door and had been stopping by for coffee and conversation for 15 years. Tonight, though, her usual easy smile was strained. Evening, Mac. She settled onto her regular stool but didn't ask for her usual order. Had some interesting visitors today. Mac's stomach clenched. Oh, couple of men in suits. Said they were doing background checks for some kind of insurance claim. Asked a lot of questions about you. How long you'd been here. Whether you ever talked about your Hollywood days, if you'd seemed different lately. The coffee pot slipped in Mac's grip, hot liquid splashing across his knuckles. He cursed, reaching for a towel, but Rita was already around the counter, running cold water over his burned hand. Careful there, she said, but her eyes were sharp with concern. Mac, what's going on? These weren't insurance investigators. They felt like the kind of people who make problems disappear. Mac wanted to brush off her concern, to fall back into the comfortable routine of deflection he'd perfected over 30 years. But Rita had lived through enough trouble of her own, an abusive ex-husband, a son lost to gang violence, to recognize danger when it wore a business suit. "Old business," he said finally. "Something I thought was buried. The kind of old business that gets current real fast if you're not careful." Rita dried his hand with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but her voice firm. "You need help?" The offer caught him off guard. Rita barely knew anything about his past, had probably assumed he was just another Hollywood refugee who'd found peace in the desert. Yet here she was, ready to stand between him and whatever threat those suits represented. "I don't know yet," Mac admitted. "But Rita, if anyone else comes asking questions, you don't know anything. You never heard me talk about the old days, never saw me acting strange. Can you do that?" She studied his face, reading the fear he couldn't quite hide. "What about your granddaughter, the documentary filmmaker? She was here last week, asking me about you." Mac's blood chilled. "Sarah was here?" Seemed like a nice girl, professional, polite. Asked if you'd ever mentioned working on any famous movies, whether you kept any souvenirs or papers from those days. I told her you were private about your past, but that you were proud of her career." The walls were closing in. Sarah wasn't just investigating. She was building a case, interviewing sources, following leads. And if she'd talked to Rita, she'd probably talked to other locals. How many people had she asked about his past? How many breadcrumbs was she leaving for Kellerman's people to follow? "What did you think of her?" Mac asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Determined. Reminded me of you, actually, when you first came here. Like someone carrying a heavy load but not willing to set it down." Rita moved back around the counter, but her eyes never left his face. "Mac, whatever this is about, that girl's not going to let it go. She's got that look." Mac knew the look. He'd seen it in Ellen's eyes when she'd decided to marry him despite his secrets. He'd seen it in Sarah's eyes as a child when she'd set her mind on solving a puzzle. The Chen family stubbornness, Ellen had called it. Though Sarah carried more Brennan blood than Chinese. "She's going to get herself in trouble," Mac said. More to himself than to Rita. Or she's going to get herself some answers. Question is, which one scares you more? The bell chimed again as the early dinner crowd began arriving. Rita ordered her usual coffee and headed back to finish her day at the shop, but not before squeezing Mac's shoulder. "Whatever you decide," she said quietly, "don't let that girl face it alone." As the diner filled with familiar faces and comfortable chatter, Mac felt like a man watching his last normal evening slip away. Tomorrow he would drive to Victorville. Tomorrow he would sit across from Jimmy Chen and acknowledge truths that could destroy everything Sarah had built. Tonight he served coffee and listened to his neighbor's easy conversation about weather and work, memorizing the weight of ordinary moments before they became memories. The last customer left at 9:30, and Mac turned the sign to closed with hands that trembled, despite the desert heat still radiating from the pavement. He'd made it through the dinner rush on autopilot, serving familiar faces while his mind churned through worst-case scenarios. Now, alone in the fluorescent-lit silence, the weight of tomorrow's meeting pressed down like a physical thing. He pulled out his phone and stared at Sarah's unanswered text, found something in the production notes. The cursor blinked in the reply field, mocking his paralysis. What could he say? "Don't dig deeper, sweetheart. Some stones are better left unturned." Or maybe, "Your grandfather is a coward who's been hiding the truth for 43 years. Instead, he typed, "Can we talk tomorrow evening? Something important to discuss." Her response came within minutes perfect. "I'm driving out to Barstow anyway. Have interviews in Victorville tomorrow." Mac's blood turned to ice water. Victorville, where Jimmy Chen was waiting with his cancer diagnosis and his cache of buried evidence. The coincidence felt like a trap closing, though he couldn't tell if he was the hunter or the prey. The phone rang, Sarah's name flashing on the screen. Mac almost didn't answer, wasn't ready for the conversation they needed to have. But her persistence was relentless, just like Rita had warned. "Grandpa, I saw your text. What's going on?" Her voice carried that particular quality he remembered from her childhood. The focused attention of someone who sensed important information just out of reach. At 8, she'd used that tone to coax stories about movie sets. Now, at 34, she wielded it like a scalpel. Sarah Mac sank onto the stool behind the register, suddenly exhausted. This documentary of yours, how deep have you dug? Deep enough to know you've been holding back. No accusation in her voice, just patient determination. I found the original crew manifest for Raiders. Your name's on there, but not in any of the official production materials that made it to the press. Someone scrubbed you from the record. Mac closed his eyes. Of course they had. Kellerman's predecessor, Roy Whitman, had been thorough in his house cleaning. Crew members who'd seen too much, asked too many questions, or possessed inconvenient memories had been quietly erased from official histories. You talked to other crew members, Mac said. 3 of them so far. They all remember you, Grandpa. They remember you being there that morning when Harrison Ford collapsed. And they remember you asking questions afterward, questions that made certain people very nervous. The diner's air conditioning cycled on, a mechanical wheeze that sounded like labored breathing. Mac thought of Jimmy Chen dying by inches while racing to unload secrets that had poisoned his life for decades. How many others were out there, carrying pieces of the same toxic truth? Sarah, you need to be careful. These people you're investigating already threatened me. Meridian's legal team called this afternoon, very polite, very professional. They suggested my research might be based on unreliable sources with questionable motives, said they'd hate to see my reputation damaged by association with conspiracy theories. Mac's grip tightened on the phone. What did you tell them? That I'm a journalist, not a novelist. I deal in facts, not theories. Her voice hardened. And that their concern for my reputation was touching but unnecessary. The pride swelling in Mac's chest warred with pure terror. Sarah had Ellen's courage, all right. The kind that led her to marry a haunted ex-stunt coordinator despite her family's objections. The kind that made her defend truth even when it cost her everything. They won't stop at threats, Mac warned. I know. That's why I need you to be honest with me. Jimmy Chen told me you were there when it happened. He said you saw Harrison Ford's handler near the craft services table that morning. He said you knew the dysentery wasn't accidental. Hearing Jimmy's name from Sarah's lips felt like a door slamming shut on 43 years of carefully constructed distance. Mac had spent so long pretending that morning in Tunisia was just another workday, another close call on a dangerous shoot. But the truth had been festering like an untreated wound, and now Sarah was picking at the scab. Jimmy's dying, Mac said quietly. I know. Pancreatic cancer. He doesn't have long. Sarah's voice softened with genuine compassion, but he wants to tell the truth before he goes. And he needs someone to corroborate his story. Someone who was there. Mac stared at his reflection in the diner's dark window. An old man who'd built a life on selective amnesia, now being asked to remember everything. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but for the first time in 3 decades, it felt like a trap instead of a sanctuary. If I tell you what I know, he said slowly, there's no going back, for either of us. I crossed that line the day I started asking questions, Sarah replied. The only question now is whether I'm walking into the truth alone. Mac looked at his granddaughter's expectant face on the phone screen and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart breaking, but the shell around it finally giving way. You won't be walking alone, he said. But Sarah, there's something you need to understand about Jimmy Chen, about why he disappeared from Hollywood, about why I've spent 30 years in this desert. Tell me. Mac moved to the window, staring out at the endless dark. Jimmy wasn't just a crew member who saw too much. He was my friend. We worked together on 4 films before Raiders. And when he came to me that morning in Tunisia, panicked about what he'd seen, I didn't just believe him. I helped him try to prove it. Sarah's silence stretched across the digital connection, heavy with implications. We documented everything, Mac continued. Took photographs of the handler near the craft services. Noted the timing of Ford's collapse. Jimmy even managed to get a sample of the coffee before the catering truck was sanitized. His voice dropped to a whisper. We had evidence, Sarah. Real evidence. What happened to it? I thought it was destroyed. Roy Whitman's people confiscated our cameras, our notes. They said it was standard procedure after an incident. We were young, naive, we believed them. Mac's reflection wavered in the window glass. Jimmy and I both signed NDAs. Took settlement money, went our separate ways. But yesterday, when you mentioned finding production notes, I realized something. Jimmy said he had copies, financial records, witness statements. Things I thought were long gone. Mac turned from the window, a terrible understanding dawning. Sarah, how exactly did you find Jimmy Chen? I told you. I tracked down crew members through... No. The word came out harder than Mac intended. How did you get his contact information? Jimmy's been off the grid for 30 years. No social media, no public records, no forwarding addresses. I know because I looked for him once, about 10 years ago. Wanted to apologize for not fighting harder back then. Sarah's pause lasted 3 heartbeats too long. A source provided his information. What source? I can't reveal. Sarah Mac's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent decades reading dangerous situations. What source? Someone from Meridian Pictures, a current employee who said they wanted to help set the record straight. They reached out to me after my initial inquiries. The diner suddenly felt arctic despite the desert heat bleeding through the windows. Mac gripped the counter as the pieces rearranged themselves into a picture he should have seen coming. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. What if Jimmy Chen isn't dying? What if the cancer story is cover? What if he's been working for them all along? That's impossible. I've seen his medical records. Which came from where? Did you verify them independently, or did Jimmy provide them? The silence on Sarah's end was answer enough. 30 years ago, Max said slowly, Jimmy and I thought we were heroes, thought we were exposing corruption. But what if we were just useful idiots? What if the whole thing was orchestrated from the beginning? You're not making sense. Think about it. A young crew member discovers sabotage, creates a paper trail, documents everything, gets his friend involved as a witness. Then the evidence conveniently disappears, everyone signs NDAs, and the story dies. Mac's voice grew stronger as the horrible logic crystallized. But the evidence wasn't destroyed. It was preserved, kept as insurance or leverage or... He swallowed hard. Bait. Bait? For what? For the next generation. For a documentary filmmaker with impeccable credentials and a personal connection to the story. Someone whose investigation would have credibility, whose revelations would be taken seriously. The taste in Mac's mouth was bitter as old coffee. Sarah, what if you're not exposing a cover-up? What if you're participating in one? Through the phone, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. You think they want this story to come out? I think they want a version of this story to come out. The version where Harrison Ford was almost killed by a rival actor's jealous handler. The version that makes everyone focus on ancient Hollywood rivalries instead of... Mac stopped, his mind racing. Instead of what? Instead of asking why a major studio would go to such elaborate lengths to create a false conspiracy. What were they really covering up? What was worth framing Bradley Morrison for attempted murder? The silence stretched between them, filled with crumbling certainties. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice small and shaken. Grandpa, if you're right, if Jimmy's been lying to me, then tomorrow's meeting in Victorville isn't about truth, Max said grimly. It's about walking into a trap that's been 43 years in the making, and they're using both of us as bait. The silence that followed Mac's revelations stretched like a taut wire between them. Through the phone's speaker, he could hear Sarah's breathing, sharp, uneven, the rhythm of someone whose world had just shifted beneath her feet. We can't go tomorrow, Sarah said finally. If you're right about Jimmy, we have to go. The certainty in Mac's voice surprised even him. Sarah, this thing has been orchestrating itself for 43 years. If we don't show up, they'll just find another way, another angle. They've been patient this long because they knew eventually they'd need us. For what? What could they possibly want from us now? Mac moved through the empty diner, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening, wiping down tables that were already clean. His hands needed something to do while his mind worked through possibilities he'd spent decades avoiding. Morrison's dead, he said. Died of a heart attack in 1987. Can't defend himself, can't contradict whatever story they want to tell. Perfect scapegoat for a scandal that needs an ending. But why now? Why wait so long? Because now there's something worth covering up that's bigger than what happened in Tunisia. Mac paused at the photo of Sarah's graduation from USC Film School, remembering how proud Ellen would have been. Think about it. Meridian Pictures isn't just a studio anymore. They're part of a multinational conglomerate. Defense contracts, pharmaceutical investments, tech development. What if the real conspiracy isn't about one actor's near-death experience, but about what Meridian was really doing in the 80s? Through the phone, he heard Sarah's fingers tapping against her laptop keyboard, that familiar rapid-fire rhythm she'd inherited from her grandmother, the sound of a mind processing information at high speed. "The pharmaceutical angle," she said slowly. "I found some financial records that didn't make sense. Meridian invested heavily in several biotech companies right after the Tunisia incident. Companies that specialized in tropical disease research." Mac's blood chilled. "Sarah, what if Harrison Ford wasn't the target? What if he was a test subject?" "That's..." Sarah's voice trailed off. "Oh God." The dysentery outbreak wasn't isolated to Ford. 3 other crew members got sick that week, but their cases were milder. I thought it was just collateral damage from contaminated water. Or it was a field test. Different dosages, different symptoms. See how the drug performed under real-world conditions. Mac sank onto a stool, the weight of the implications crushing down on him. And when one subject nearly died, they needed a cover story. A fall guy. Morrison. Morrison. Mac stared at his reflection in the dark window, seeing not the weathered diner owner he'd become, but the younger man who'd been too naive to recognize evil when it wore a suit and tie. Jimmy and I weren't witnesses to a crime. We were part of the experiment. Our evidence was probably planted for us to find, which means tomorrow they clean up the last loose ends. Jimmy delivers his rehearsed confession about Morrison's fictional guilt. I corroborate the story as a credible witness. You document it all with your impeccable journalistic credentials. Case closed, real conspiracy buried forever. Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Except you just figured out their game." "Did I? Or is this exactly what they expected?" Mac rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 68 years. "Maybe they wanted us to uncover the pharmaceutical angle. Maybe the biotech investment story is just another layer of misdirection. How many shells can they build around the real truth? Then we don't play their game. Sarah, we've been playing their game since the day you started this investigation. Every source you've contacted, every document you've found, every interview you've conducted. How do you know any of it's real? How do you know I'm real?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Mac could hear Sarah breathing, could almost feel her trying to process the possibility that everything she thought she knew was carefully constructed theater. "Because you're scared," she said finally. "Really, genuinely terrified. That's not something you can fake, not for 43 years. And because you've been trying to protect me from the truth, not lead me toward it. If you were part of their plan, you'd be encouraging this investigation, not warning me away from it." Mac felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, but recognition. Sarah had inherited more than Ellen's courage. She'd gotten her grandfather's ability to read people, to see past the performance to the truth underneath. "So what do?" he asked. "We go to Victorville. But not to play their game." Sarah's voice carried a new edge, cold and sharp as winter steel. "We go to break it. And if Jimmy Chen wants to perform his little confession, he can do it knowing that we're recording everything. Not for their documentary, but for ours." Through the diner's window, Mac saw headlights sweeping across the desert highway. Just passing traffic, but his heart hammered anyway. After tomorrow, there would be no more hiding. "Sarah," he said quietly, "whatever happens, I need you to know. I never meant for you to inherit this burden. I know, Grandpa. But some burdens choose us." The drive to Victorville took 2 hours through desert that had once felt like sanctuary but now stretched like an open wound under the morning sun. Mac gripped the steering wheel of his ancient pickup while Sarah sat beside him, her equipment bag bristling with cameras and recording devices she'd retrofitted with backup systems, insurance against the kind of technical failures that had plagued investigations before. They'd barely spoken since leaving Barstow, each lost in the weight of what they were walking toward. But as the off-ramp came into view, Sarah finally broke the silence. "Whatever Jimmy says, whatever story he tells, I want you to know I believe you. About the experiments, about Morrison being framed, about all of it." Mac nodded, not trusting his voice. The simple act of being believed, after 43 years of carrying the truth alone, felt like breathing clean air after a lifetime underground. The address led them to a nondescript conference room in a business hotel, the kind of anonymous space where deals were made and secrets traded. Mac's instincts screamed warnings as they approached the door, too isolated, too convenient, too perfect for containing whatever was about to happen. Jimmy Chen was waiting inside, and Mac's first glimpse of his old friend confirmed his worst fears. The man looked exactly like someone dying of cancer, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving with careful deliberation. But Mac had seen enough real illness to recognize performance, and Jimmy's eyes held the alertness of someone very much alive and very much in control. "Mac," Jimmy said, rising with studied difficulty. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Wouldn't miss it," Mac replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Been waiting 43 years to hear what you have to say." Sarah was already setting up her equipment, movements efficient and professional. But Mac caught the subtle way she positioned the cameras, not just to capture Jimmy's confession, but to record anyone else who might be watching from the adjoining rooms. "Before we begin," Jimmy said, settling back into his chair with practiced frailty, "I want you both to know this isn't easy for me. I've carried this secret my entire life." "Must have been heavy," Mac said. "All those years working for Meridian Pictures." "Oh, you didn't mention that in your initial interview, did you? Your employment with their subsidiary companies from 1983 to 2019? Jimmy's careful mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Sarah's hand moved to her backup recording device, the one hidden in her jacket pocket. "I don't know what you think you've discovered." "We've discovered that you're not dying," Mac said quietly. "We've discovered that every piece of evidence you've provided was manufactured. We've discovered that Bradley Morrison was framed for a crime that was actually an illegal pharmaceutical experiment." "You're talking nonsense," Jimmy replied, but his performance was cracking. "Morrison tried to kill Harrison Ford. I saw—" "You saw what they told you to see, what they paid you to see." Mac leaned forward, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading dangerous situations. "The question is, what are they paying you to cover up now?" Sarah's cameras were rolling, capturing everything as Jimmy's composed facade finally shattered. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. These people, they'll destroy you both before they let the real story come out." "What real story?" Sarah demanded. "What was worth 43 years of lies?" Jimmy looked toward the door, then back at them, and Mac saw something he'd been waiting decades to witness. The moment when a carefully constructed lie finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. "The experiments didn't stop in Tunisia," Jimmy whispered. "They just got better at hiding them. Crew members, extras, anyone they could dose without consent, testing everything from performance enhancers to memory suppressants to," his voice broke, "to compounds that could induce specific illnesses on command." Mac felt the room's temperature drop as the implications crystallized. "They've been using film sets as testing grounds." "For 40 years, Jimmy confirmed. "And I've been helping them cover it up because they made me an offer I couldn't refuse after Tunisia. Join them or join Morrison in an early grave." Sarah's equipment continued recording as Jimmy Chen, the man who'd spent 4 decades as an unwilling participant in Hollywood's darkest secret, finally told the truth. But even as relief flooded through Mac at hearing the words he'd waited half a lifetime to hear, he knew their real fight was just beginning. Because somewhere beyond that conference room door, the people who'd orchestrated 4 decades of systematic human experimentation were realizing their carefully constructed narrative had just been torn apart by the 2 people they'd trusted to deliver it. The climax wasn't Jimmy's confession. It was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, growing closer. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Mac's hand found Sarah's shoulder, a silent signal they'd agreed upon during the drive. Keep recording, no matter what. The cameras were still rolling when the door opened to reveal 3 men in expensive suits, their faces carrying the practiced neutrality of people accustomed to cleaning up messes. "Mr. Chen," the lead man said, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "This wasn't the arrangement." Jimmy's composure crumbled completely. "They figured it out, Richardson. 43 years of planning, and they still figured it out. Richardson's gaze moved to Mac with something approaching respect. Marcus Brennan, the stunt coordinator who wouldn't stay buried. Do you have any idea how much effort we've invested in managing your conscience? Not enough, apparently, Mac replied, surprised by his own calm. The recording continued. Sarah's equipment captured everything as Richardson laid out the scope of Meridian's operations. Decades of unauthorized medical testing, government contracts that blurred the lines between entertainment and experimentation, a web of subsidiary companies that had used Hollywood productions as cover for pharmaceutical trials spanning 4 decades. But what struck Mac most wasn't the revelation itself. It was how tired Richardson looked as he spoke, like a man who'd grown weary of maintaining an elaborate lie. Even the corporate machine had limits, and they'd finally reached theirs. The Harrison Ford incident was a miscalculation, Richardson admitted. Too high a dosage, too public a victim. We needed a story to contain the damage, and Morrison was convenient. But you two, he shook his head. You were supposed to be assets, not liabilities. People have a way of disappointing you, Max said. 3 hours later, they sat in Mac's truck in the hotel parking lot, the weight of what they'd captured settling between them. Richardson and his people had left with the resigned efficiency of men who knew their war was over. Jimmy Chen had been escorted away to whatever arrangement awaited him, witness protection, perhaps, or simply a different kind of cage. It's over, Sarah said, but her voice carried exhaustion rather than triumph. Mac nodded, watching the desert horizon blur with heat shimmer. The story, yeah, but the rest of it. They both knew the recording would expose everything. The experiments, the cover-ups, the systematic abuse of power that had hidden behind Hollywood's glamour for decades. There would be investigations, prosecutions, congressional hearings. Justice, of a sort. But justice couldn't resurrect Bradley Morrison or give back the decades he'd lost to false accusations. It couldn't undo the damage done to countless unknowing victims. It couldn't restore Mac's faith in the industry that had been his life, or erase the knowledge that he'd been complicit in his own exploitation. What happens now? Sarah asked. Mac started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding him in the present moment. Now we go home. You edit your documentary. I make coffee and eggs for truckers passing through Barstow. We learn to live with the truth instead of running from it. The drive back felt different, lighter somehow, despite the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Mac found himself thinking of Ellen, wondering if she'd have been proud of what they'd accomplished or horrified by what they'd discovered, probably both, knowing her. As the sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, Mac realized something had shifted in the space between his ribs. The weight he'd carried for 43 years hadn't disappeared, but it had changed form, transmuted from burden to responsibility, from secret to story worth telling. Grandpa, Sarah said as they pulled into Barstow, what Morrison said to you that last day on set, do you remember it exactly? Mac smiled, the memory no longer sharp enough to cut. He said, truth has a way of surfacing, Mac. Might take years, might take decades, but it always finds the light. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He was right. Yeah, Mac said, parking outside the diner that had been his sanctuary and his prison. He was. Inside, Mac moved through the familiar routine of closing up, wiping counters, checking locks, counting the day's modest take. But everything felt different now, as if he was seeing his life through new eyes. The diner wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was just a place where an old man made coffee and remembered stories. Later, as Sarah drove back toward Los Angeles with terabytes of footage that would reshape Hollywood history, Mac sat on his front porch and watched the desert stars emerge. The truth was finally free, swimming upstream after 4 decades underwater, ready to break the surface and breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a truck's horn echoed across the highway, the sound of people moving through the night toward destinations unknown. Max smiled and went inside to sleep the dreamless sleep of a man whose burdens had finally found their proper weight. The story that stayed with him now wasn't about conspiracy or cover-ups. It was about the moment when truth and courage intersected in a roadside diner, proving that some things are worth the wait, even when that wait spans a lifetime.